Welcome to Module 2. Today we're going to talk about how standardized norm reference tests fit within our comprehensive evaluation.
So we're going to look at norm reference tests through three different lenses. First, we'll think about situations where we get good, valid information from our tests. When we can trust the data, it can add a lot of value to our comprehensive evaluations. Next, we'll talk about situations where we can't trust the test results. We'll talk about situations where there's clear bias in our tests. We also will talk through situations where biases are less obvious. Finally, we'll think about norm reference tests within broader comprehensive evaluation processes. And so we'll discuss how these tests don't always answer our clinical questions and how we need to complement them with additional test data.
So we're all on the same page. In this video, I'm talking about standardized norm reference tests. These are those tests that come in a package with a manual, sometimes a really cool bag. The main thing that we report from them is a standard score and percentiles. Now, when I give talks on norm reference tests, I always feel like I'm criticizing them. I'll say up front, norm reference tests can be a powerful tool within our comprehensive assessments. Later, we'll talk about times when they don't provide very useful information, but they can add a lot of value to our assessments. Norm reference tests were designed to show a student's relative standing compared to their peers. Test developers, they do lots of research and development to identify the types of probes and questions that differentiate between higher performing and lower performing students. We then compare our students' performance to the hundreds or thousands of other children who took the same test with the same exact questions and probes. This allows us to get standard scores and percentiles, which then allow us to estimate the relative standing. That's it. That's the goal, and they can do a pretty good job at giving us this information. We are most interested in knowing if a student's speech or language skills are significantly lower for their age or grade. You've seen the term significant discrepancy in the criteria for speech and language impairment. On the surface, it's pretty straightforward. Is there a significant discrepancy between my student and their peers? But how do we determine what is significant? And can we ever be completely certain that we are right? The practice many of us were trained on was the old 1.75 standard deviations on 2 norm reference tests, and that was part of the language criteria. This was straightforward, but there were a lot of problems with the approach.
The revised guidelines for language give you the option of completing a norm reference test as part of your comprehensive evaluation. Now, when it's time to interpret a student's performance, there's more ambiguity than the old 1.75 criterion. So it's up to us to figure out what exactly is a significant discrepancy. So, how do I know what a significant discrepancy is? Where do I find information on the standard score that is a significant discrepancy from typically developing students? Well, this information is typically published in our test manuals. It can be published in other places as well. We need to know that we can only use that information if we can trust it. And no one's going to tell us what test to use or what score is good or what data are valid. This is wonderful ambiguity, which we as SLPs love. Now, to take a pragmatic approach to this, I want to show what this process can look like. So I grabbed the test from one of our test cabinets. I'm not going to say the name of this test because I don't want to implicitly suggest that this is a good test or a bad test. But I'm sure you've seen and probably have used this particular test. We'll just call it that test you know. Now, what I like about this test is how they showed sensitivity and specificity for different cut scores. Okay, I'll take a few steps back here. When we give a test, we know that we get a standard score, percentiles, and the standard scores, those are what we see here on the left-hand column. These are different standard scores that a student may receive. You can also see that these standard scores aren't completely random. 85 is one standard deviation below the mean, 77 is 1.5, and so on. The two columns on the right show the sensitivity and specificity. When we look for the quote-unquote best cut score to use, we typically look for the best compromise of sensitivity and specificity. That is, how we correctly identify children with impairments and don't identify children who do not have impairments. Here, we see that a cut score of 80 gives a nice compromise with the numbers. So does that mean that everyone who scores below 80 has a significant discrepancy? Can I just be done and have a cup of tea? Well, it's more nuanced than that. I think it would help to take a quick look at what those different numbers really mean. I know, we said there'd be no math. Instead of getting deep into psychometrics, let's take a step back and think about what tests are really doing when we get different scores. Let's pretend that we have a crystal ball and we can definitively say which of these 18 kids has a true impairment. The orange faces represent children who, through magic, are known to have a true impairment. The green faces represent children with no impairment. Next, I'm going to show you some slides that show where these children go when we adjust our cut scores or our standard scores from our norm reference test. In other words, when we use a higher or lower standard score as our cutoff, how often are we getting it right? Let's start with a score of 85. With this score, we see that all 6 of the students who scored above 85 do not have an impairment, as summoned by our crystal ball. However, 3 of the kids who do not have impairments scored less than 85. So if we used 85 as our lone criterion, we would have gotten it right for all of our children with impairments, those in orange, but we would have mistakenly said that 3 students in green had disorders. Let's see what happens next when we use a lower score. What if you use a standard score of 80? We see that one of the typically developing kids went back to the no impairment group, which is good. Now only 2 of our green, no impairment students scored below our cut score of 80. But now 2 of our orange students who have true impairments are in the normal range, scoring above 80. So the groups are more evenly distributed, but we still get it wrong sometimes. When we go down to 77, we see that only the students with true impairments scored below a 77. We are not incorrectly identifying any typically developing students anymore, but we see there are more of the orange group who moved into the right column, meaning that the test says they do not have a disorder because they scored above 77. When we go down to a score of 70, it's no surprise that only kids with true impairments scored in this range, but we're getting a lot more of our kids with impairments showing up and scoring in the typical range when we use such a low cut score. So hopefully you think that was a fun, approachable way of looking at our statistics and thinking about sensitivity and specificity. But you still may be thinking, okay, John, that's great, but what number do you use? What number should I use when I give that test, or any other test? I'll say with this particular test, if you're going to administer a single test and make a determination based on a single number and nothing else, your best bet is probably a cut score of 80. But as we saw with our faces, you're still going to get it wrong some of the time. We also know that the practice of using a single score from a single test is not only bad practice, but out of compliance with both DPI and IDEA guidelines. Let me state one of the themes for our day. A norm reference test is just one piece of data within the comprehensive assessment. Now, it can, in some cases or many cases, depending on your practice, be an important piece of data, but we need to see how it fits into the student's broader comprehensive evaluation. And then we need to determine if it converges with our other assessment data. So let's move forward with more of a problem-solving approach to see how we can use this norm reference test data within our comprehensive evaluation. So what if my student scores 85 on my test? Well, that's quite a bit lower than most of the population, but we also know that it's a range of ability that we're looking at. We're definitely running the risk of incorrectly identifying students who do not have disorders, as depicted by our green faces, and whose needs may be better met by another educator. At the same time, this is the lower end of the normal curve, and it could be a student who has true communication needs that are impacting their education. So we might say, this test, they're on the lower end. It's minimal, but it could be something there. When we go down to 80, most of the students are separated correctly. There's a higher likelihood that there's a true impairment that interferes with the student's education. I'm feeling more confident, but I still need to verify this. So maybe I'm moving from the minimal to moderate needs types of range. Now let's go down to a score of 77. Now we see that there are more likely just students with true impairments here. It's more likely that this is a true communication need that's impacting their education, and we can see how it converges. When we get down to a score of 70, now we're getting into more of a moderate to substantial range. So if these tests are correct, if we can trust the data, this student is very likely to be experiencing notable difficulties in school that we can confirm or possibly disprove with our comprehensive evaluation. But John, we need to be objective in our comprehensive evaluations. Isn't this too subjective? Aren't we being indecisive? Isn't this wishy-washy? Well, one thing that we can't lose sight of is that there is no crystal ball when we're assessing children's speech and language skills. We're evaluating communication. We're not taking someone's blood pressure or measuring a student's height. These are some of the more objective measures we have, our norm reference tests, but there's still going to be a level of measurement error whenever we're looking at different types of human behavior, such as speech and language. Approaching assessment decisions with a problem-solving framework and judging if there is a minimal or more substantial risk will help us complete more accurate evaluations. Now, it's not a coincidence that I use the terms minimal, moderate, and substantial. These are the same terms that we see on the rubric for considerations for language impairment that DPI published. I really like this rubric. It's a reminder that, it's not one decision, it's not one task, it's not one test, it's not one piece of evidence that makes a decision, but rather looking at the whole picture, doing the comprehensive evaluation, and seeing if we're observing more in the moderate to substantial areas, that we're seeing something that does appear to be a true communication need and something that could benefit from specially designed services. So for example, if I'm seeing across the board difficulties and I believe that I can trust the data, I have more confidence that there are substantial communication needs. I see the value that this test adds, helping confirm that there are true communication needs. Or maybe I'm seeing lower performance on my norm reference testing, but the student is functioning well in the classroom. Maybe there's a reason that my norm reference test data may be inaccurate, and I'm getting a more accurate picture from their academic functioning. In this case, possibly the norm reference test isn't adding a lot of value because of some biases or just unfamiliarity with the testing of my student. Or maybe I'm seeing that our student is having true difficulty with academic tasks and performance, but the speech and language testing is looking better. It's looking more related and at the level of their peers. In this case, maybe the root cause of these academic difficulties is not a communication issue, but something else. And this helps add value in identifying the root cause or ruling out the root cause of a communication difficulty. So now I'd like to shift to thinking about using norm reference data, or more correctly, not using norm reference data when we can't trust it. So I first want to talk about some more obvious biases. We'll talk more about these as we go throughout our time together. These are things we should all hopefully be quite on the same page with. So if we're testing students who have limited English proficiency or English isn't their first language, we know that there are biases inherent with our tests that were developed for and normed on English-speaking children, particularly monolingual English-speaking children. Translating tests is problematic. We know that the profiles of bilingual and multilingual speakers are different. So if we assess the English skills of a fluent bilingual English speaker, it's going to look different than the English skills of a monolingual English speaker. And in many ways, with our traditional testing, it'll appear that their English skills, their English competency is lower than we would expect when it's in fact just a characteristic of being a bilingual speaker. We also know that a good number of our students speak different dialects. We have mainstream dialects, non-mainstream dialects, and our norm reference test, they generally assume that our students are using mainstream general American English. Most of our norm reference tests, they don't consider differences in grammatical and phonological dialectal patterns. So if we are using these tests and our students have some dialectal features where they may be penalized on the test, it's obviously not going to give us much useful information. So with these more obvious biases, norm reference tests, they really add little values. We should not report standard scores. We should use some of our better evidence-based assessment tools that we'll talk about through our time together. Things like dynamic assessments, language sample analysis, criterion reference assessments. I also want to talk briefly about some less obvious biases. I think sometimes we think, all right, if my student isn't speaking a non-mainstream dialect or isn't bilingual, then there shouldn't be any biases. But I think there are some incognito biases that we need to consider. Now, if our student isn't familiar with the format of the testing, there can be a bias for that student. So if you're not as familiar with the format of a test, it's going to be more hard for you, you won't do as well, and it's not going to reflect your true ability. Now, I'm going to go through some of the features of our test that are shared by a lot of our tests and discuss how they can introduce bias. So there's a Western value of speed, and what this value assumes is that you're going to do something on demand and relatively quickly. And this shows up in the expressive vocabulary test and some of our other tests. You're expected to answer the question in 5 seconds. And I think this is part of what the test is designed to do. If you have stronger vocabulary skills, you're going to answer quickly because you have nice, strong representation of the words, a larger lexicon. You'll be able to do it with more ease, and you can answer the question quickly. If you have weaker vocabulary skills, you may answer more slowly because you don't have as strong representations. It may take you more time to access the lexical information. So in this case, it can work out well if there is that shared assumption of the value of speed. Now, let's see what happens if someone doesn't share the value of speed. Even if they have strong vocabulary skills, they may answer a little bit more slowly because this isn't something they're familiar with. This seems kind of weird that you're making me do this and do this quickly. And I may answer slowly and look like I have weaker vocabulary skills when in fact my vocabulary skills are fine. The format is interfering with my performance. And students with weak vocabulary will answer slowly because it's weird and also because it's a hard task for them because of their lower vocabulary skills. The problem is we don't necessarily see the difference between kids who have true, stronger, and weaker skills. Other types of things that may vary across people with different backgrounds and different experiences, how familiar are they interacting with picture probes? How familiar are they asking and answering known information questions? So where I know the answer as an adult and an expert, I'm still asking you to give me the information, respond to my cues. That can seem a little weird to children from different cultures where they don't have as much experience of performing on demand for parents by answering known information that their parents are asking. Also, playing with unfamiliar adults, just being in these situations where you may not have as much familiarity. I think we can all agree that our norm reference tests require a certain level of frustration tolerance. Ceilings are frustrating. They can be frustrating for us as examiners. They can be very frustrating to students. We keep pushing them until we reach to the point where they no longer have mastery. This is a pretty regular experience and expectation in the dominant culture. We often push our kids in our formal schooling environments, expect them to fail, expect them to get to a point where they have difficulty. What if this is less familiar, right? So if you don't have as much familiarity and practice and stamina with that frustration tolerance, you may stop testing, stop your effort a bit earlier, just because you're not as familiar with that format. I also want to get back to a point I made before that, we're looking at human behavior. I was part of a work group recently where a group of SLPs said that their colleagues don't know how to interpret language sample data because it's so subjective. And I've heard that a lot about different types of assessments, and there certainly is some truth to it. If you're collecting a language sample and the child refuses to engage with you, we probably don't see the child's true communication skills. But what about our students who completed that test, on the floor while playing a game to keep them engaged, and you're putting stuff on your head and there's announcements in the background? We may add some notes describing the context, but how do we treat the number? I know personally that I've had to make a lot of adaptations to get a child to finish a norm reference test, and they aren't by the book, but I didn't think twice about reporting the standard score and percentile. So we need to remember that these are our best efforts, but there is always going to be a level of error and subjectivity. And in particular, when there's limited familiarity and any biases are involved, the student's going to perform lower than our expectations. So now we're on to our third and final part of today's presentation. What do we do with norm reference data that don't answer our questions, that don't provide a lot of clinically useful information? I'd like to take a look back at early 2000s, John, when I was doing more regular evaluations. So when I was at Children's Hospital, I did a lot of evaluations on middle school and elementary school age children, gave a lot of norm reference tests, and this would be a common profile of total scores and subtest scores that I would see. And I would say something like language impairment characterized by particular difficulty with verbal working memory, and came up with that decision by seeing their concepts and directions were fairly low and their recalling sentences was fairly low. Moving forward, when I was doing evaluations as part of a Scottish Rite clinic, I would give a large battery of language and reading tests, and I would say something like, oh, let's take a look at this. The test of word reading efficiency, that looks quite a bit lower than the other tests. So I would say things like, reading impairment characterized by particular difficulty with single word reading rate. So what's the problem? Well, in retrospect, I think the best thing I could have said for that child from Children's Hospital was he had a language impairment or a language disorder, developmental language disorder, whatever terminology we want to use. He had significant communication needs in the area of language. That test was not designed to give a profile based on differences in performance across subtests. In addition, those differences were relatively minor. Also, what we know about language disorders is all kids with language disorders tend to have difficulty with verbal working memory. It didn't really add too much. It didn't characterize that child's individual strengths and weaknesses, areas that would have an impact in how I can help serve that child to communicate better. It gets even more problematic with the scenario I showed with the Scottish Rite Clinic, where we're comparing across multiple tests. And what I actually realized when I started doing that protocol more often is all of the kids scored lower on that one test. I think that was a quote unquote harder test. I think it was probably normed on kids who were higher performing or for whatever reason. But I think all kids with reading disorders, reading impairments, have a lot of difficulty with that type of task. I would have been better off saying she has a reading impairment. Another thing I've done is gone to my norm reference tests and picked some items that they got wrong and did some therapy. I would do some drill therapy, especially at a children's hospital type of place where people would come once or twice a week, and I'd have to have something to do, some sort of therapy activity. I used to think that was, a rational idea because these test items are these very important skills and something that kids need as a component of their communication. Now, these skills can be very important that we look at with our norm reference tests, but that's not why they're chosen on tests. They're chosen to be included in a test because they distinguish between high and low performers. Back to the first point of the day. What can we do with our norm reference tests? We can see your relative standing. How do we see your relative standing? Well, we have a bunch of items that were designed to distinguish between high and low performers. So we can think about something like sentence repetition, right? Shorter sentences versus longer sentences. You can think about all of the reasons why that would be difficult for our students with language needs. Having more information to hold in working memory, more complicated syntax and complex syntax, embedded clauses, more complex vocabulary and inflectional morphemes. You get all of those things together, that's a really hard task for a child with a language disorder, and it's going to be more effective at differentiating kids with and without disorders. But I don't think that working on sentence repetition skills would necessarily give a student better access and engagement in the curriculum. What about some of those grammar close tasks? Here a boy is walking, here a boy is and looking for sleeping. Those can do a great job too. We know that zero marking inflectional morphemes, so say, hear the girl eat instead of eats, that can be a classic marker of a language disorder, especially in preschool and early school age kids, with a big caveat, who speak mainstream American English. Right, so hopefully the potential bias against African American English speaking students is obvious to us with that type of task, but also it's not because inflectional morphology is the foundation of all language ability, in my opinion. It's because this task does a really good job of differentiating kids with and without disorders. So how can we get better information on educational impact and communication functioning? That's going to be the meat of what we talk about. We're going to really discuss things like criterion reference assessments, language samples, dynamic assessments, looking at the curriculum, interviews, observation, really filling in those pieces, and that we have historically done a bad job of training people in and supporting. And that's our goal with this project. So as a quick summary, I don't want to lose sight that yes, norm reference assessments, they can add value to our comprehensive evaluations. When we can trust the data and we use them the way they were intended, they can add value. We need to know they're prone to bias, those obvious biases and less obvious biases, and they only give us a small portion of the picture of our students' ability. They have limited insight into educational relevance, and we really need to complement them with additional assessment data.
So for this module, our application activity is going to be completing an evaluation or IEP checklist. Additional information and a description and a short video is available to you on the application activity documentation. Also, don't forget to complete the module completion survey, just a very quick way for us to see how many people have completed this training video. So you can pause the video, do the QR code and sign up, or just click on the link. So thank you for your time today. As always, any questions, comments, feel free to reach out to any of us. I hope you have a good day, and I will talk to you soon.